Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are tuning into the Systems Change in Practice session at the Nature for Life Hub. My name is Josie Raine. I am the Strategic Communications Specialist for the Nature, Climate and Energy portfolio at UNDP. I'll be your moderator for our panel discussion coming up next. My own background includes public service campaigns, corporate marketing and behavior change for conservation. So I'm personally thrilled that our panelists today represent such a wide spectrum of sectors, knowing how valuable cross-application of expertise is for system change in practice. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, Katie Heffner, who is Senior Director of Partnerships and Engagement at the Rare Centre for Behavior and the Environment. A warm welcome, Katie.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We also have Tara Austin, partner in the Ogilvey Behavior Science Practice. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we have Melissa Miners, who is the Senior Global Manager of External Affairs at Unilever. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started. We heard from Midori's opening speech that we need major transformational change, and that until the perceived opposition between environmental and economic interests is reconciled, society will not properly account for and value nature, and we will struggle to act at the pace and scale necessary. We heard how we need to identify and support the narratives that bridge nature and development, nature and economics, to enable systems change. We then heard from Professor Centola about how global narratives work and how they can create social change and shift systems today. This session will explore the potential for a narrative shift on how we value and account for nature from three different perspectives. Let's get started. First question. Katie, let's start with you. RARE is known for pioneering principles of social behavior change for conservation. What have you learned over the past decade about using these principles? What works and what doesn't in social change for conservation?
Sure. It's a great question and one we've thought a lot about. We've learned that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We know that people are people anywhere in the world, and there are universal aspects of human nature and psychology that apply to everyone, but how those aspects manifest in their real life is entirely context dependent. So you can have an individual approach to meeting individual audiences in the most appropriate way, because we know, like, humans are humans, they're social animals, but what that looks like in terms of their social life, who their influencers are, what their norms are, may be wildly different on one side of the world versus the other. And so you really have to understand your audience before anything else. At our Center for Behavior and the Environment, we have a process called behavior-centered design, which marries those principles of behavioral science, those universal motivators of human behavior, with this process of design thinking. And it allows you to systematically and strategically understand how you can apply behavior change to different conservation settings. And so we've learned that behavior change is really about the methods and processes that get applied to context versus just a one-size-fits-all stamped approach. And then the final thing that I'll say is we've also developed this theory of cooperative behavior adoption. And we know that many conservation challenges out in this world are dilemmas around common pool resources. And so part of what we've spent a lot of time thinking about is how do we develop a guide that helps move your target audience groups through phases to ensure that cooperative action around common pool challenges. So things like fisheries, climate change, that's been really helpful when we consider how to motivate groups and when you design behavior change programs for conservation outcomes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. Let's turn to Ogilvey and Tara. Tara, at Ogilvey, you focus on communications that change behavior. What have you learned about catalyzing nature-positive consumer behavior, and what works and what doesn't work from your perspective?
Well, I think the thing that we understand is that the biggest challenge with all nature-related communications typically relates to what we call psychological distance. and the fact that the challenges of climate change feel to people far off in terms of time and space. It's often things that happen on the other side of the planet in the distant future to other people. And so there is this distance between our behavior today and the consequences of that tomorrow. But we have been exploring different ways to close that distance. One of the most critical ways, and there are a number, but one of the most critical ways is actually what we call concreteness, which is just making things concrete, imaginable, and real, and bringing them as much into the here and now as possible. Just allowing people to really imagine and often visualize the difference that a behavior can make. You may be familiar, for example, with little images that have been painted onto the drains that you see in the city that have popped up. And around the drain, it might say the sea starts here, trying to close that spatial distance, showing people that actually if they drop a plastic bottle into the gutter, it doesn't just stay in the gutter, it ends up in the sea, out in Bali, or all of these beautiful places that we all want to stay pristine. It ends up on our beaches. Similarly, in a number of environments, they've done things like putting signage onto beaches that show this is where the water level will be in 2050. And again, we're just making visual, concrete, bringing into the here and now, making real that which is further off in time. So all of the ways in which we can do that, which we can visualize the impact of our behaviors, I think that's one part of what's going to be critical for shifting the framing and the narrative, and making all our immediate behaviors feel more important.
Thank you so much, Tara. Melissa, maybe I could turn to you next. And for you, what do you see as the 3 to 4 most important nature positive transformations that are relevant to Unilever's brands? And what role can multinational corporations play to shift us towards a nature positive systems change?
Thank you. So Unilever has a number of goals which contribute towards a nature positive society. We set out a new set of goals in 2020 to see us through the next decade. And in terms of nature positive, the first step is assessing our impacts. We're a large consumer goods business. We operate in 190 countries, and our material impact assessment showed that our largest impact on nature was through our agriculture footprint. So we source many soft oils, many different commodities, such fruit and vegetables from around the world, but our biggest impact is with palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia. So the first piece is assessing our impact, which we've done for the last decade or so. And then measuring is the kind of what I'd identify as number 2 in terms of how we roll this out with farmers. So we have something called our Sustainable Agriculture Code, which we roll out to hundreds of thousands of farmers. And we now have evolved into our next stage of this, which is our regenerative agriculture principles. Again, implementing these with farmers and measuring our impact on nature and agri-supply chains, and not just the kind of impact on our sourcing programs, but what are the landscapes, what are the connecting landscapes around them? How do we take accountability for the ecosystems that touch our sourcing areas? And the third step, I guess, is disclosing this. So sharing as we learn, and we do this in many different ways through the Carbon Disclosure Program, reporting on forests and water, and more recently with our landscape program. So at the COP21 Paris Agreement in 2015, we committed to start taking a landscape approach to palm oil sourcing. So focusing on particular ecosystems and making sure that the agricultural expansion doesn't go into nature dense areas, protecting things such as wildlife corridors. We have a great partnership with WWF in Sabah, Malaysia, where we're actually increasing palm production on less land, restoring a riparian reserve and wildlife corridor next to the sourcing areas. But I think that the disclosure part there is the big change in the way the world is going, and particularly around the global biodiversity framework and the move to mandatory reporting. So I think we're going to see lots more of this to come from us and other businesses.
Excellent. Okay, a second question for everybody. I'd love to dig a little deeper and think about how we can transform change on a large scale. So Katie, Rare works in specific communities around specific goals. It would be great to hear from you about what you've learned about catalyzing social change at larger scales and what's on Rare's horizon for scaling social change.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's completely true that to reach the kinds of global conservation outcomes that we need, we absolutely need to be thinking about change at a larger scale. And that can be pretty challenging when you hear what I said earlier about how we need to tailor approaches to local contexts. But at Rare, we reconcile this challenge by thinking about scale as making it easy and less costly to replicate tailored approaches versus taking tailored approaches that worked in one place and just stamping them and replicating them other places in the world. So what I mean by that is, like, how can we support more local leaders and communities in taking behavioral science that we know works and the methods that we know work, and also the types of interventions that we know work, whether that be managed access to sustainable coastal fisheries or increasing plant-rich diets to reduce carbon emissions or land degradation, how do we help local leaders and communities to take those methods in behavioral science and then combine those with interventions effectively? And so part of what we think a lot about is how do we build capacity of the field to make that change that we need to see happen faster and stronger and better. So at Rare, we're doing this in a lot of different forms. For example, in one place we've launched, or in many places we've launched, the Coastal 500, which is the largest global network of mayors and local government leaders who are all working towards sustainable coastal seas and combining that with some thriving communities on the shorelines. And so they're sharing best practices and lessons learned worldwide on the methods that are making change happen. Within our Center for Behavior and the Environment, more specifically, we have resources on platforms such as behavior.rare.org. We're running trainings, we have advisory and design services, and we do a lot more just to focus on how do we build the capacity of these leaders around the world to drive the conservation outcomes that we need to see and reach that global scale that really needs to happen to keep this world running.
Thanks, Katie. Tara, from your experience, what would it take for an industry-wide shift towards nature-positive behavior? And what is needed to achieve major narrative shifts in how we value nature?
Well, I think what we really need here is both a left and a right brain response. And historically, people thought for a long time that the left brain was sort of rational and the right brain's emotional. It doesn't work like that at all, but they are different, the hemispheres of the brain. And Dr. Ian McEwen, who's world leader in this space, has shown, and the neuroscience now shows, that the left brain is very myopic. It only really understands exactly what is in front of it and every single task individually. And I think for our kind of left-brained world that we're in, what we need to do is break down big systemic challenges into tiny little pieces of a problem that we can put on a spreadsheet. A classic example of this is where we had the challenge of getting Recycle for London, trying to communicate with all of London about what it was that they should be recycling. Terrible problem. There are about 42 different levels of service in one capital city, from a terraced house to the house next door, different levels of service. You can recycle food, you can't. What do you put on the side of a bus that travels all over the city to tell one message to all of London? Nightmare brief. But what we showed was actually we needed to break down the problem completely differently. We used a lovely behavioral model, COM-B, in order to show them that actually everyone was recycling, or they weren't, but these young people that we were targeting were recycling at home and in the office and on the street, but they weren't recycling at home and they didn't have a recycling bin. So it was very much the last mile first brief. Instead of talking to these people about what they should be recycling, we got them to get a recycling bin, and we doubled the number of bins in London from sort of 1.1 to 2 point something or another by changing the brief and changing the challenge and creating an intermediate goal or proxy for the behavior that we wanted to see. So we need to break down the behaviors that we need differently in order to make them relatable, accessible, and ultimately break down that big brief. But that's the left brain piece. I think the really challenging bit is how we see this systemically, and that's what the right hemisphere of the brain does. It doesn't have words. It doesn't speak. If you disable the left hemisphere, you can't speak, you can't use words, but you do understand things and how they connect together. And you understand systems, you understand music, you understand the way things are connected. And that's what we really need from society, but it's a much more tricky brief. Other than everyone taking psychedelics, which is actually one distinct route that a lot of people are exploring to more eco-friendly behaviors because it encourages nature connectedness. Other than that, we do need to look at how we get groups to take pause, to take perspective. It's famously said that the first time that we saw the blue marble photograph of the whole Earth against the black of the night sky of space, that was a very important moment for mankind, because up until that point, only astronauts had ever looked back on our planet and seen that we are spaceship Earth. We're one planet. We are connected, whether we like it or not. And so things like that photograph, all manner of things, we need to come up with more processes, systems, opportunities for providing perspective for people, and really starting to understand how outside of our own little boxes, outside of our own little industries, we are connected, and perhaps in ways that we hadn't even anticipated. And I'll just leave you this, on that the president of Colombia was recently at the UN discussing the fact that his nation has been ravaged by the drug industry. And actually, whilst we might not, sitting in our industries, think too much about drug policy reform, actually ending the drug war, as far as he's concerned, is going to be one of the things that will allow the lungs of the world to have life again. So we might think of that as a very lateral industry that is banned, very much so, since 1971, but it's actually integrally connected to what it is we need to do, and it's something that I think is going to become more and more important in the quest to heal our planet.
Thank you, Tara. And Melissa, how has Unilever approached some of the stickier systems level transformations like regenerative agriculture? And particularly, I'm interested in if you've actually deployed or used any narratives that have helped you find ways to mobilize change across your brands.
Yeah, I'm going to build on Tara's kind of big picture Earth piece, because I think it's a nice intro into how we might be able to mobilize change at scale, because as we know, nature is a local thing, but we're trying to deploy regenerative agriculture principles over many different geographies, which it often becomes a tailored approach. And we often say with regenerative agriculture, it's so new, and we worry that it's just businesses talking to each other about regenerative agriculture. And we have worked with One Planet Business for Biodiversity to have an aligned business vision, but is this kind of a common language with farmers? And at the moment, we're in the process of that kind of virtuous cycle of normalizing the regenerative agriculture conversation with farmers. And I should have said at the beginning that the farmers are the kind of the face of this, and they're essential to this, and they're the stewards of the land. So it's about continually learning from farmers, the people that know the land the best, and trying to incentivize good practice. A part of this at the moment in terms of big systems changes around the whole global repurposing subsidies to support the transition to regenerative agriculture, and therefore do any of these subsidies reach the farmer? I mean, this is some of the big picture levers that we're looking at the moment, and I refer back to the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 18, which is on this topic. And then also taking the burden off farmers. So how can Unilever take the burden off farmers in terms of insurance, repurposing subsidies, incentivizing best practice? And I can give you an example of how we've tried to do this in Iowa with soy sourcing for our Hellmann's brand. We've partnered with Practical Farmers of Iowa with other companies as well in 2018 to create the Iowa Regenerative Agriculture Cover Crop Program. And this works to increase the adoption of cover crops and other practices such as reduced tillage, diverse rotation, and advanced nutrient management among farmers within the company's supply chains. And again, it's about learning from these farmers and hearing from these farmers and trying to create scale and using the power and leverage of Unilever to create scale.
Thank you so much. What was really interesting to me is that we heard from 3 different practitioners working on systems change at really different points in the system. However, there were some really common insights across that. One major one was that local and tailored understanding is so important in order for us to be effective. But that doesn't mean that scaling isn't possible. And making sure that we have perspective at that local and tailored level, and bringing that into our understanding and application when we're thinking about affecting systems change at a global level is key to that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and sincere thanks to all our panelists. Thank you.